Thank you so much, Roshi. Thank you so much for inviting me um, to share tonight. And I'm also really grateful to the community for having me. And I just say welcome to everyone who's joining us tonight here in the Zoom space on Facebook and so forth. I'm really moved to be sharing this space with you as well. Um, yeah, I'm really, well, I'll start by saying tonight I wanted to just explore um, or have this dialogue around this kind of intersection of grief and justice and liberation and trying to figure out what the Dharma is, you know, around all of this as well. And for me, these things, these topics, these areas are things that I am thinking about every day that I'm moving through energetically. I am calling in my practice to hold space for me as I move through the arising of, my own experience of grieving and mourning, um, and grieving everything, not just one thing in particular, but this fundamental grief of being in this realm, being in a human body, and being in this time, this period, this experience of so much struggle. Where so many of us are really struggling to get the resources that we need, not just to be happy, but to be safe, to be free from trauma, to feel connected to community and to others, um, to feel as if they are not being erased, um, to gather the basic resources to balance what for many of us seems to be this overwhelming discomfort um, right now, this overwhelming anxiety, fear. Um, so grieving, for me, grieving everything and allowing myself to grieve, right? Seeing that allowance as such an important expression of my Dharma practice, right? And then also beginning to understand that as one of the things that I have to commit labor to if I am also interested in this work, in the experience of liberation, both social liberation and also ultimate liberation. As many of you know, for me, there's no ultimate liberation without social liberation, that I can't bypass the world to get to the ultimate liberation, that I have to move through the world, through my living, through my body, through my relationships with others, through phenomena itself, in order to earn the experience of the ultimate. To begin to use the relative as skillful means, which that skillfulness opens the door to the ultimate. And for many of us, I think that we would very much more prefer to skip over the messiness of the relative, or as we would say in Dharma terms, to skip over the mud, you know, and just get to the lotus. But as we also know, that there is no lotus without the mud, which is another way of saying that we have to roll around in the dirt and get dirty in order to understand what the significance of flowering into a lotus means. Like you have to earn the lotus. We're just not sashaying around, dipping into, just trying to reach in and grab the lotus like the lotus you see on my shirt from the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. the beautiful logo. Um, it's just like we just want to dip in and kind of grab the lotus and say, oh, we've done it. But what Buddha Dharma actually is asking us to do is to step into the mud itself, you know, to step into the confusion, to step into the chaos. And quite honestly, we're already in it to begin with. So what we're actually struggling to do, we're struggling to kind of bypass the fact that we're already wallowing in the mud to begin with. We don't want to acknowledge the fact that we're already muddy and dirty, because that's too complex, right? It's too complex to deal with that, because we just want to feel good. We want to feel good. Somehow we want to feel good and practice Dharma and get to the lotus. But again, as I was just really kind of leading us into at the beginning, is that like we have to move through the mud. We have to name the mud. We have to name the chaos, right? We have to name the suffering and say, there you are, and I'm in it. I am moving through this. But as I move through this, I am developing a sensitivity to clarity. I'm trying to get clear as I move through this mud. And not only am I trying to get clear, I am trying to give a shit about everyone else who's also wallowing through the mud. And especially, I want to care about the people who don't even realize that there's mud to begin with. So I'm getting clear. I'm trying to develop this care for others, which we would call wisdom and compassion, right? And when I start bringing this wisdom and compassion, this care and this clarity together, this creates this tremendous momentum, right? Where I begin to say, oh, there's this mud, but you know what? It's okay. It's okay to be muddy. It's okay to be dirty. I am not the mud. I'm in the mud, but I'm not the mud. I'm not the dirtiness. And when we start having that experience, that clarity, that awakening, that opening, then that is the moment our lotuses begin to blossom. That I am not the mud, but here we are. Here I am. And what begins to deepen that awakening, that blossoming of the lotus, is also moving from this perspective or this central isolating idea of I or me into this perspective, this expansiveness of we. Like we're here. We're struggling to be well. I'm struggling, you're struggling, we together are struggling to get free. We're struggling to deepen this clarity and care to begin to really awaken the brilliance of this lotus, which again, the lotus represents our own embodied, awakened consciousness, our wisdom nature, our Buddha nature. That awakening of that clarity doesn't mean things disappear. It means that maybe finally we allow everything to be in its place. And then we begin to understand the nature of everything. It's hard to figure out the nature of things when we're always fighting, accepting those things to begin with. Our energy gets siphoned off into the aversions, the pushing away of things, instead of into this really basic nuance practice of saying, oh, this is happening, this is here. Right? And for me to be in the most authentic relationship with what's present, I have to do this labor to accept it. I have to name, acknowledge, and accept the mud if I'm actually interested in moving beyond the muddiness. But to do that kind of work of acceptance, we have to move through what I call the brokenheartedness, which is this, for me, this utter fundamental disappointment that I have to deal with the mud to begin with. And for me, that brokenheartedness is also where my grief emerges as well. And this fundamental disappointment. And this is a practice that I do every single day. I think this fundamental disappointment comes on without, without me even consenting to it. You know, because really what I'm doing in my Dharma practice is engaging in the struggle to allow everything to be present, even the things that I don't want to deal with. And so, in that particular commitment, I am also offering permission for everything to come when it needs to come. So, that includes the heartbreak, it includes the grieving. And I've talked about this before. The last time I was sharing space here in the community, um, but speaking about racial justice, for instance, for me, growing up, becoming aware of the system, particularly of racism, white supremacy, and all of the ways in which um, racism is channeled, into um, into actually quite a few things, into ideas of coloration and class, into body types and ableism, into issues of gender and sexuality. Racism actually and white supremacy finds its way impacting all of these issues that many of us think have no relationship to each other, but in fact they do. Um, but when I was growing up, coming into the world, becoming conscious of these systems and these dynamics, at the beginning, I really didn't accept the fact that there was racism. I just, it was just something that it was just a struggle. It was something that I didn't want to deal with. It was a source of pain. It was violence, and it was always something that I was pushing away. It was always something I was fighting against. And I just thought, well, if I just fought against this, then that's what we're supposed to do. So I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, is to fight against it. But as I got older, particularly moving through my activism and coming into Dharma practice and meditation, where I began to be shown and taught was that there was this even much more profound work of coming into relationship with this, again, this fundamental disappointment that there is a system that has created such intense, overwhelming violence for many of us. And that for most of my life up until that point, I had been avoiding that brokenheartedness. I was skipping around it, and reacting to it. But I hadn't been able to do the work of moving into relationship with that fundamental brokenheartedness. And because I was choosing not to do that, or because I didn't know how to do it, I felt like I wasn't doing the real liberatory work of disrupting the system of violence, right? And of course, that real fundamental liberatory work was about me, was about the ways in which these systems, racism, many systems, right, created this experience of trauma for me that made it hard for me to be in my body. It made it hard for me to be with my mind. That made me, well, that created this experience of being consumed by anger and rage, sadness, sorrow, frustration. And I was being consumed by these things because I actually wasn't doing the practice of actually tending to this basic, deep disappointment, this brokenheartedness. And that was keeping me from really being in tune with the actuality of things. And this seems completely abstract, I think, to some of us, you know. But I think that, again, for many of us, we talk a good game about social liberation, about certain issues that we're committed to, but we haven't really touched the issue. We haven't really felt the reality, the impact of that issue in our bodies and in our minds, and which has made it really difficult for us to have an empathy or a perspective as to how these issues impact others, our communities around us. That we're terrified of that basic experience and brokenheartedness, which is also part of that experience, that these basic experiences that we feel maybe we won't survive if we allow ourselves to experience. And that was the case for me when this became, more and more apparent in my practice, that there was this brokenheartedness that kept me from actually touching into the reality of these systems of violence, that this brokenheartedness seemed too much and that it would ultimately consume me, that I would be erased if I allowed myself to really open to these really complex, overwhelming emotions. Um, I think this is the part of the work that's moving into relationship with the brokenheartedness. I think this is the work that seems really isolating. Um, it's isolating, it's lonely. Um, it's not something that we go through and are able to make it like a fun, great social media thing that some of us love to do, right? It's not something that people want to see pictures of and live updates of. This moving through brokenheartedness, and this has been years of practice for me as I began to really move into the brokenheartedness. That it was something. It was work um, that meant moving to these deeper parts of who I was and to begin to name these experiences and begin to allow the space, this natural space, to emerge, to hold everything, which space is always present, regardless of if I acknowledge it or not. But the work of being with the brokenheartedness is to remember that there is always space holding everything. And for me, coming from my tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, which is a tantric tradition, um, and working with a system of deity practice. That was this idea of space was something that I felt I was being led into skillfully through the practice um, of deities, particularly the practice of Tara, which in Tibetan Buddhism, of Vajrayana Buddhism, is female Buddha associated with compassion and liberation. Um, but for me, it was through the practice of Tara that began to lead me into the space that was holding all the heartbreak. We call the practice of Tara mother practice, and there's a system of practicing with the mother in tantric traditions. And the mother, you know, the mother, the female aspect in tantric traditions is an expression of space itself. So when we say the mother, what we're saying is that nothing can exist without space. And so Tara becomes the mother of all the Buddhas because Tara is an expression of the space that allows all phenomena to arise. And it's through my devotion to Tara and practice of Tara that leads me into a much more spacious relationship with my brokenheartedness. And when we begin this work and when we get really underway with this work, we will begin to notice that our activity in the world changes, right? We begin to slow down. Because this work of moving into the brokenheartedness is associated with the body. It's associated with embodiments. And embodiments for some of us, and this is myself as well, is a long, slow, multi-year project of bringing awareness back to my physical self, to the sensation of physicality. But what that has meant for myself and many of you, I assume, is that we have had to come in also into relationship with the trauma, which is also physical sensation. And that's where the real work for many of us is being in relationship to the trauma. That becomes a central obstacle for our embodiment. And that many of us are in different places and different positionalities in terms of our bodies or our relationship to our bodies, and that always has to be honored. So when I talk about how the work of being with brokenheartedness begins to slow us down, that's when we begin to get real slow, real methodical, because we have to bring a level of deep respect and sensitivity to the experience of trauma that many of us are working with and moving through. The body itself resides in the moment. The body isn't in the past, it's not in the future, it's just right now, it's right here. Our minds are everywhere. Our minds are nonlinear, actually. Our minds are everywhere at once. Our bodies are right here in the moment. So when we're coming back to the body, when the mind is coming back to the physical self, we're coming into this present moment, right? And the present moment isn't moving at the speed of the nonlinear. So the urgency that many of us feel in the world is disrupted when we're actually coming back into relationship with the body. And of course, coming back into a relationship with the body means we come back into a relationship with the land, with the earth. And I think this is crucial for us right now because the earth needs us to remember our fundamental interconnectedness, our fundamental interrelatedness right now. The earth, the land, is full of data that I believe we have forgotten in our evolution through modernity and capitalism and systems of power that takes us so far away from our bodies and the earth. That the earth is full of data related to sustainability. It's full of data related to healing and to community. It's full of data related to how to live in the most direct, authentic way with it and with others who need the land, the earth, to survive. And I believe that our bodies are extensions of the earth, and that the earth is an extension of our bodies, and that this fundamental basic connection is disrupted when we experience disembodiment. And it's not to say that if we don't ever experience embodiment, we'll never experience connection to the earth, which is not the case. But I do believe that we have to at least try, engage in the struggle of being back in relationship to the body and the earth. And I think that is enough. Our attention is outward facing right now. Right? It's our attentions in the world, it's in situations, it's in court cases, it's in movements, it's in politics, it's in entertainment, it's in social media, and all of that great stuff that we all love. But the true work of liberation is about also learning to turn that attention inward, to bring that attention, energy, and labor back to the work of the internal world of the mind and body, how that internal world can open our relationship to the phenomenal world. That I began to move through the world eventually by first moving into my internal world and then beginning to relate to the external world through my internal world. To begin to love people, to develop compassion for people, because I've gone inward to develop compassion and love for myself. And that my capacity to love others is directly related to the capacity to love myself, not the other way around. Again, to bypass our basic experiences is the same thing as saying that we're going to bypass the relative to get to the ultimate. Instead, we have to go through the relative in order to touch into the expansiveness of the ultimate. But again, we don't get there without a commitment to touching into the brokenheartedness. That touching into the brokenheartedness is what, in my practice, I'm calling grieving. It's trying to figure out who and what I am within the context of so many things that are being lost, so many things moving around and shifting. Of trying to figure out how to get my resources, how to gather the resources that I need in order to fulfill the needs that I have, when the gathering of these resources seems sometimes impossible. How to work for justice, right? How to disrupt systems of violence, when this work seems so impossible sometimes. And how do I allow myself to grieve that disappointment? There has to be grief in justice work. There also has to be anger in justice work. There also has to be love in justice work. There has to be compassion in justice work. There has to be community in justice work. I think the one thing that we really don't understand the positionality of in justice work is that of grief. How do I let my heart break, and how do I allow my brokenheartedness to be held? And I want to acknowledge the grief that we're all holding in our practice, in our lives right now, the grief for ourselves, the grief for our communities and our collectives, the grief that many of us are just has been unrelenting, maybe for our whole lives, but for a lot of folks, the grief that's been unrelenting, particularly over this past year of this pandemic, this past year of continued racial injustice, this past year of environmental crisis, financial instability, you know, this period where members of our community are experiencing increased violence and aggression, particularly our Asian and Asian, Pacific Islander community, our Sangha members, our friends, our family, our lovers, our family. That this work of grieving means that I begin to touch into and hold space for this deep realization that if one person in my community is experiencing violence, that I am also experiencing violence, that we are experiencing violence. And grieving how easy it is for me to skip out of that expression of we. How easy it is to say, well, that's something that they're experiencing. That has nothing to do with me. That we have to actually do this labor to touch into this experience of us and we. That if one person is unsafe, then somehow I am unsafe. I've done, a lot of just work, personal work, community work, research, and so forth, related to the AIDS epidemic, the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, the height of the AIDS epidemic. That's a particular grief and trauma that I carry in my practice as a queer um, male-identified person. That I come out, that my identity has been formed by my community's struggle with that epidemic. But even when that epidemic really began to become known in the 80s into the 90s, um, I think one of the powerful kinds of rhetoric that emerged from, particularly from a lot of um, churches, Christian communities, was that we have AIDS, that we have AIDS. And that for me, that statement, like even if you had no connection to the epidemic, or if you didn't know anyone who was struggling with this, that somehow that statement was this intense statement, this intense mantra that brought us into the heart of this brokenheartedness, this struggle. And I think that for many of us, it's a difficult thing to utter. Even now, to say that, oh, there are people, who are struggling around racial injustice, racial trauma, to say, oh, to begin to say, oh, well, those are, these are Black folks or Asian folks who are experiencing this. But what would it be? What would it mean in our practice to begin to shift into this mantra saying, no, we're struggling with this. And as we struggle with this, how do I begin to see the ways in which I perpetuate this violence for others? Because this is about stepping into a shared experience where I begin to name I begin to get curious about how I am a part of the suffering of others. And it's easy. I think it's important to acknowledge too that, like, yeah, some of us don't need any more. We don't need to suffer more. We don't want to take on this empathy. Like, because we're struggling to do the basics in our lives right now, let alone take on this big expansive struggle of other communities. And I think at that point, if we're, of course, if that's coming up for us, I think it's really important for us to really do the work around developing a deeper trust in our practice, in Buddha Dharma, in these basic teachings that, you know, our minds, the spaciousness of the mind, the emptiness of the mind, that our minds hold everything and can hold everything if we allow it to, if we begin to trust it. And that we move into this deeper relationship with the mind and begin to disrupt reactivity and move into a space of responsiveness. And that this work of um, of being radical, of radical action, actually, radical means that we get to the root of things. You know, and we'll never be able to get to the root of things if we're not coming back to ourselves to understand how the roots of injustice are actually being perpetuated in our experience, through our beliefs, through our attitudes, through the things that we don't know yet. If we're not doing that, then we're not doing this basic fundamental work of disrupting systems of violence in the world around us. It's easy to go to the marches and the protests and to give money, and to put our Black Lives Matter signs out in our yards and to wear our T-shirts, right? That's easy, but not so easy to ask, wait, how am I a part of the system of violence? Even more so, how am I unconsciously enjoying this system? That's an easy doorway into the brokenheartedness. And it has been for me as I'm engaging in my work around patriarchy, ableism, um, cisgender privilege as well. When I began to ask these questions, just related to how there are just parts of all these systems that I actually unconsciously really like, because it helps me to feel safe, right? It helps me to get resources. But to begin to bring attention, awareness to these experiences, and to allow our hearts to break, to allow ourselves to say, and it's really fucked up at the same time, right? That I have what I have and I enjoy what I enjoy because there are so many people who don't have what they need to be well. And this brokenheartedness isn't meant to like intense to intensify isolation and individualism, but it's intended for us to start taking responsibility for this fundamental discomfort, instead of reacting to this fundamental discomfort and creating labor for others around us that others are not consenting to. Like, if I don't do my own work, and I just come work for other people. And again, the work slows down when you choose to follow this particular path. Like there, it's not, this isn't beautiful, great, pretty work that you can document. This is messy, it's ugly. And if you're not willing to get messy and essentially move into this utter complexity, then you're not ready for the responsibility of being free. Nor are you ready to free others. So, as our time slowly comes to an end for my time with you all, um, I just want to again just acknowledge and honor the grieving that many of us are moving through. Um, I want to say that it's your grief and it's also our grief that we're holding right now. And that my prayer, my aspiration is that the resources that we need in order to allow our hearts to break and to show up for that brokenheartedness, that we get all the resources that we need to move through this for ourselves and for others. And I pray that we make this work a fundamental part of our justice and liberation work, not just socially, but also ultimate liberation. I dedicate this time together, our work, this conversation, to our ancestors, all those who came before us, that they are freed from their experiences of suffering and trauma. I dedicate this time, this merit, this energy to our descendants, all of those who are coming after us. I dedicate this energy, this merit to all those living in this moment, that we all may be free from harm, that we all may experience happiness, love, compassion, may we all be safe and have all the resources we need in order to experience wellness, and that we all continue moving towards social and ultimate liberation together. Thank you so much for this space and time.